How would you refute classical liberalism and feminism, especially on ethics, which they love to talk about, right?
Yeah.
Emotional abuse,
Right.
and you're oppressing woman and all that.
Right.
And I'm asking this especially because I'm in college, so I have to deal with those people daily, and it's kind of tiresome.
So classical liberalism derives its notion of ethics from natural rights. And the problem with natural rights is not really that you can't say that there's, quote, natural rights. It's rather that these are proven or known via evidentialism, via brute facts, via just looking at nature. So a lot of times the natural rights theorists and proponents will just say that, well, it's just kind of a self-evident thing in nature that we have these rights. So they're given to us via the universe, via, and it's all arbitrary. I mean, what is it? What does that even mean? A natural right? Because as I always point out, I mean, when I look out at nature, I mean, if man is just another being amongst the natural beings, I mean, I see nature having pretty rabid predator-prey relationship. So on what basis, if I'm a natural rights proponent, again, there's no theism necessarily involved in this, right? We're going to be atheistic for the sake of just looking at nature, the so-called natural rights proponents think. And again, this is connected to natural theology in the Western tradition as well, right? When I look at nature, I see predator and prey. Why shouldn't I just destroy, rape, kill, loot, pillage, and steal? Why ought I to submit to things like the non-aggression principle of the classical libertarian schools? Now, I'm not saying you should do those things. I'm saying that it's arbitrary. They don't have a basis or justification for the metaphysics of the natural rights or the ethics of the natural rights. So just apply Hume's critique. Well, the fact that something is the case does not get me to an ought. And so they're constantly committing the is-ought fallacy. That's what I would say. No matter how many facts of nature you list or what you think is a fact, you'll never get to, so therefore you ought not injure or hurt another human being. And it's just a really simple defeater for any of these libertarians, right? I mean, these libertarians basically, they get to like sophomore, freshman level philosophy, and then they check out. Like they're done, they're out, right? They don't go beyond that and point out, well, it really doesn't make sense to talk about rights without the assumption or a basis for explaining what a being is that has rights or a will, volition, right? Free will, libertarianism. What are you talking about if you don't have some notion of the person? What does it mean to have free will, liberty, right? What does it mean to have these principles if you can't justify the principles? And so natural rights philosophy, coming out of natural theology of the Middle Ages, falls apart because it's just as faulty as the natural theology arguments for generic theism. That's no God. Doesn't tell you anything. And the natural world doesn't grant you this supernatural non sequitur. If I'm going to start with the natural world, and then I just jump to a supernatural non sequitur, this metaphysical being, I'm just going to repeat David Hume's arguments. No, you don't get that. That's a non sequitur. So just apply David Hume's arguments to theism, to the libertarian, classical liberal metaphysics of natural rights. That's an invalid leap. The fact that these things occur in nature, where do you get that there's a universal principle of natural rights out of that? So I'm just doing the exact same move of David Hume to the theology of the natural theologian proponents that I would do. I'm going to apply that argument to the rights philosophy of the classical liberal libertarian people. And you would, by extension, just apply that to the feminists as well, because their philosophy is just as much a bunch of atheist liberalism as well. Father Deacon, what would you say?
Yes, like a lot of debates, and people don't realize this, they'll just start with something that people as a whole might agree to. Equality is a good thing. You'd mentioned rights. And you might agree with that. We encounter this all the time when we're doing presuppositionalism. Our question isn't about whether we agree with something or hold something to be true, but do we have justifications for that?
Yes.
From our worldview?
Exactly.
So what you want to do, you don't give your opponent anything. You say, look, why do you think that that's actually a good thing? Because I could play the devil's advocate and just say that, hey, look, it sounds like just an assertion. What actually makes that right? I mean, in the sense of being correct, that it should be binding on me morally. Is it because people agree with that? Because it sounds good? And what you're doing is you're applying these kind of Socratic questions, and you're going to show them that basically, as you go through this, they'll give an answer, and then you question that again. Well, why would that be? That seems arbitrary. What makes that actually justified or morally obligatory? You will find that they have no idea what they're talking about. They're just asserting and parroting these things that they've heard and been brainwashed.
Hey, Father Deacon, can I give you an example?
Yes.
What would you say to somebody who, let's say you were talking to a sort of a modern atheist libertarian person who said, well, Father Deacon, look, I mean, the non-aggression principle is clearly something that's necessary and good and useful. So we're going to agree to the NAP because it's even good for your own benefit. So it's good for you. Why wouldn't we hold to the non-aggression principle when it's beneficial for you as well? That's a classic, typical libertarian type of argument about the NAP.
Yeah, exactly.
What would you say in response to that?
Well, first, notice all the terms that you're using. It's good. It's beneficial. What does that mean?
Exactly. Well, it promotes your own well-being for you to adhere to this.
And then you go a step further. What is well-being? And what you will notice is you go further, that their presuppositions and worldview conditions what those terms mean.
Right.
Because in the end, my well-being notion of eudaimonia or something like that, it's probably going to be something very different than a libertarian. That's why I don't have a problem. So because they put that as their first principle, and that's another thing that you might point out too. Sure, in certain situations, I might agree with a non-aggression principle. But you're not saying that. You're saying that's a first principle in which everything's ought to be based on. That it exists in this vacuum is this kind of like, it's almost like a deity, right?
It is. They treat the principles like deities, you know.
That's not true. So, for example, the libertarian puts freedom, and that's spelled F-R-E-E-D-U-M-B. They put freedom is their first principle. Now,
as if that's a self-evident thing. Like, what does that even mean, right?
Like freedom. Well, to some extent, but that's not our first principle. In fact, I would be in certain situations and contexts willing to aggress against somebody and throw freedom out the door. So again, it's rolling everything back in terms of these questions that ask, like, why is that your first principle?
Yeah, I mean, there's no self-evident idea of freedom. I mean, what does that even mean? Freedom to do what? Freedom against what? Who is what is a being that has freedom, right? That presupposes an agent with will. Those are metaphysical things, right? And so you're in the problem that Hume points out. How are you going to get all these metaphysical things from empirical sense data? That's the tradition that you're coming from if you're an Enlightenment libertarian.
And also, why don't they apply those principles of the NAP with their child raising?
Ooh,
we got to enter into contractual and non-aggressive. It's like, no, then...
Well, didn't Milton Friedman and some of them actually, they did apply it? Like, they'll be like, oh, no, you actually shouldn't, discipline children. Doesn't he have some weird view like that? Like,
yeah, see,
and you have a right to kill kids or boot them because they're leeching on you.
Property. Anyways, going back to the kind of feminism and classical liberalism, the second argument. So the first argument you make is you precept them. You ask this kind of Socratic question until you get them to a point that I'm just arbitrarily, this was a starting point, actually condition what these words mean that we are all pretending we agree on: equity, society, the good, all these other things. Second argument is that, as Jay had pointed out, to historically situate where these ideas are coming from, which ties kind of into the first thing about kind of arbitrary starting points and first principles and presuppositions. What you see is all of these are post-Enlightenment ideas, and there's a revolution of thought in society that occurs at this point. And as I always identify it, it's a Promethean rebellion.
Yeah.
And it's a neo-Gnostic movement in which the natural order of hierarchy, both heavenly and in the earth and nature and society, is rejected and thrown out. And this kind of, like you see in the French Revolution,
right,
this kind of equality, egalitarianism is asserted in place of that.
Right.
And so
there's a great example in the chat from Lee Boy where he says, well, could I just say that freedom is clearly and self-evidently known to mean a system in which the supreme leader enforces his will upon other men? That's what, in other words, if it's kind of arbitrary, right? So I could, every dictator has basically said he is the, dictator of the free peoples of his society, right? In other words, it's arbitrary. I can just define, I can say, well, I believe in freedom, but freedom is you doing what the dictator says. Do you agree?
Hey, speak again. Yeah, go ahead. It was just roboting. I don't know if it's my connection or yours. Go ahead.
In other words, freedom isn't a self-evident brute fact. In other words, it requires a context, because somebody could, every dictator, for example, has said, well, I'm promoting the freedom, which is you doing what the dictator wants. Freedom is you following my dictates. That's what frees you.
Yeah, that's another good point too. So going back to the second argument, you just call somebody out on, well, look, let's say this is an evil and perversion in itself, overthrowing the kind of natural order of hierarchy, which feminism and classical liberalism both assume. Second of all, a radical autonomy is asserted in place of the kind of the ancient world of being under God.
Yeah.
And now man is God. In the kind of Protagorean dictum, man is the measure of all things, which is and that which is not. And therefore, now you get rights language.
Yeah.
Well, rights language in this Enlightenment notion is defined in what? Self-ownership.
Right. I
own myself, and therefore I have these things we call negative rights.
It's all cashed out into it's based.
That is absurd in terms of Christianity, that you own yourself.
It's based in
and that you have this autonomy.
It's based in the laissez-faire presuppositions of that time period.
I'm gonna jump out and then jump back in. Put me in for
okay,
to be the co-host again,
right.
And I'm gonna see if your audio gets better.
Okay,
is that all right?
Sure. Yeah. So great questions there, Jayo. Appreciate that. Let's move on to the next question. Yeah, it's like the idea of rights connected to self-ownership, everything being cashed out as homo economicus in the laissez-faire, rise of Adam Smith, capitalist period. John Locke, right? This is all seeing man as basically an economic unit, and economics as like everything. Everything is reduced to economics. And then what happens in the Enlightenment is you get like these after this, the scientific revolution, you get these different disciplines all basically trying to lay claim to what is the ultimate grand narrative reductionist story. Oh, no, it's not economics, you see, it's physics. Oh, no, it's not physics, you see, it's biology, right? Biology is the one that has the unified system that reduces everything down to, the full explanation, right? Oh, no, you see, it's physics, and we're all determined, right? And there's a great chapter in the Louis Dupre book that I mentioned, Passage to Modernity, the Essays and Hermeneutics of Nature and Culture, where the chapter on Descartes is great for this, because he makes Father Deacon's point, where he says that what Descartes did was transfer the ancient and medieval world's notion of meaning and reality out there to God, principles out there in the world. Descartes' revolution is to take all of that and collapse it into man's mind. So man's mind now becomes the de facto determiner of reality. And you especially see this with Kant. But that Copernican revolution in philosophy occurs with Descartes and his radical foundationalism.